Yes, well, tonight I probably will just talk about my first experience as an Archibald subject, which was the most graphic. I've done it a couple of times, but that was, this one I'll tell you about was really something. The Archibald fascinates Australians perhaps more than any other visual arts event. Its history is laced with controversy and outrage, and there's a real anticipation about its outcome every year. And every year the distinction between popular appreciation and the judgment of the cognoscenti is brought into sharp relief by the prize awarded by the Packers for the best portrait, which is never the same, as far as I know, as the canvas chosen by the judges. Have there been any exceptions to that? Does anyone know when the Packers has been the same as the judges one? No, I don't think so. This year, the Packers Prize was won by Tara Moss's portrait, apparently. Very attractive girls with long legs do very well with the Packers. It's hard to know why the Archibald arouses such national interest. Would an exhibition of photographs of well-known identities raise much interest at all? I suspect not. What makes the Archibald so interesting is that contemporary artists are given license to go well beyond the realism of a photo portrait and distort reality, sometimes quite severely. The purpose of such distortion is to allow the artist to inject his own feelings and observations about the character of his sitter onto his canvas. A mean mouth can be made much meaner, a cruel, glinting eye made even crueler. What the artist believes to be the true inner nature of his sitter can be revealed. The liberty to do this, of course, was not always easily accepted. William Dobell was challenged by two fellow competitors in court when he was awarded the Archibald for his portrait of fellow artist Joshua Smith back in 1943 on the grounds that it wasn't a portrait, it was a caricature. Luckily for future freedom of expression, the court found in Dobell's favour, but the court case and the publicity had a severely debilitating effect on William Dobell. Of course, what the artist apparently thinks of the sitter isn't made obvious until the painting is done. And quite a few sitters, and I'm one of them, as you'll hear later on, thinking the artist must admire them immensely to want to paint them, are shocked to see what the artist has done with them. I suspect there have been quite a few subjects of Archibald winning portraits who have wished they'd never been foolish enough to sit for the artist. I've been painted a few times, and the one I'll tell you about is the earliest, by Cliff Pugh back in 1973, when I had emerged as a playwright with my early plays, The Removalists and Don's Party. Getting the portrait painted was quite an adventure. We'd met Cliff and his partner sometime before, and as we lived not all that far away from his magnificent mud brick mansion in Cottlesbridge, which he called Dunmoochen, Kristen and I were often invited for dinner. It was a particularly exciting time to be up there, as Labor had just won government and Cliff was heavily into arts politics and knew most of the Labor heavies. Cliff painted not only Gough Whitlam, for which he won the Archibald, but quite a few of the other Labor Party ministers. In fact, there were times when it seemed that half the Labor cabinet were up there at Cliff's place, either getting themselves painted or plastered. It became a sort of retreat for the Labor heavies who fancied a kind of hippie weekend wonderland, peopled by eminent artists and writers, and oodles of attractive and intelligent and often quite lightly clad young female artists, poets and political groupies. Because we lived close, Kristen and I became the sort of reserve guests called on at the last moment if someone had cancelled and the guest list needed to be bolstered. We jumped at the chance. Life up at Dunmoochen at that time was truly exotic. Not only were there political groupies, some who went on to stellar heights in their later careers. I remember one future Vice-Chancellor of a large Australian university being upbraided by the hostess for not knowing how to chop onions correctly. But there were native animals wandering through the vast baronial halls. Emu, wallabies and wombalong, the world's largest wombat, which Cliff often painted or drew. Wombalong was Cliff's pet. He went everywhere with him. Cliff would leave him in the car while he drank at the local pub, and Wombalong soon learned to toot the horn loudly when he felt his master had had enough. Cliff swore he was a lovely and docile creature, full of love for everyone he encountered. He wasn't. Wombalong was one of Australia's most vicious marsupials and had fits of rage and often darted under the table and bit every female ankle in sight. Cliff would stare in amazement at this behaviour, seemingly forgetting that it happened every second night, and drag Wombalong out from under the table and punch him solidly on the snout. Wombalong was so thick-headed that the blow, which would have knocked a human unconscious, only made him shake his head for a second, but it was luckily sufficient for him to get the drift that more ankle biting was not on for that night. Our son Rory, thankfully, is now 36 years old, but he was lucky to have made it past his infancy, as we took him up to Cliff's in his basket one night and left him in a side room on the bed, where Cliff assured us he would be quite safe. Luckily, one of Australia's greatest novelists, Christina Stead, was passing the room, heard snuffling, and saw Wombalong peering down into the basket, apparently about to make a meal out of our son. She plucked him out and cuddled him for the rest of the night. The national furore was bad enough when poor Lindy Chamberlain claimed that a dingo had eaten her baby. Chris and I would probably be still in jail, accused of belonging to some dark satanic cult if we had claimed ours was eaten by a wombat. I was rather alarmed one night when an eminent cabinet minister allowed one of the local young artists to help him experience smoking hash, and he then decided that my wife Kristen was the most beautiful woman that had graced the earth since Helen of Troy. I'm not suggesting the hash had anything to do with this perception, as I've always felt the same thing about it myself, but the minister soon had her over in a corner, letting her know that as a well-known journalist, she should be interested in a week-long trip to Canberra to do an in-depth article on how he was proving himself to be the most brilliant politician in Australian history. Kristen, seeing that I wasn't too happy with this development, decided it was time to politely decline and extricated herself. But by this stage, our cabinet minister couldn't bear to have her beyond arm-stroking range and pursued her avidly around chairs and over sofas. I kid you not, this was Dunmoochun in the Labor years. Kristen fled outside, and by the time I could reach them, Cliff's heavy front door slammed in my face, and I heard what I hoped was the sounds of indignant struggle coming from the other side of the divide. I wasn't taking any chances, however, and butted the gate open with my shoulder and carted Kristen off to our car. It's said that in order to be a politician, one has to have a hide as thick as a rhinoceros. So I shouldn't have been surprised when the politician rang at 6:30 next morning to tell Kristen that the plane tickets and accommodation had already been arranged for the week-long visit to Canberra. Not that it was all sex, drugs and portraiture up there. Sometimes big political crises were avoided. One night, another cabinet minister was there who was having an all too well publicised fight with one of his cabinet colleagues. A young and very attractive young lady declared that it was hurting the Labor Party and got straight on the phone and demanded that the other government minister get on a plane in Adelaide, fly straight to Dunmoochun and sort it out for the good of the nation. She listened to his answer, turned to the cabinet minister in the room and said, "He wants to know what's in it for him if he comes. Come and assure him I'm not wearing any pants. The Cabinet Minister, more than a little drunk, moved over, did the assessment and confirmed the fact. Unfortunately, on that occasion, the inducement wasn't enough, but she tried. After many of these evenings, Cliff decided he knew me well enough to paint a portrait which would reveal the true David Williamson. I had no particular fears. My image of myself was that I was rather a good-natured, straightforward, affable chap with no real vices to speak of, life of the party, everyone's friend, sparkling conversationalist, upfront and honest, not in the least bit sensitive and very sympathetic to other people's misfortunes. So the process started. I sat for a few sketchings. Then the painting itself started. I wasn't around to see what was happening, but I was sure my good and endearing characteristics would be bound to leap out of that canvas. One morning, I got a phone call from one of the ladies who was in Cliff's circle of friends. She told me that the portrait was shaping up, but that Cliff was having problems with my hands, and that hands were the hardest part of an anatomy to get right. It was a very hot February Melbourne day, and I drove up to Dunmoochun. As usual, the doors were open, and I wandered in, but no one seemed to be around. I called out a few times, then finally, the lady who had phoned emerged from the pantry stark naked. She didn't seem the least bit flustered, but I can't say the same for myself. She asked me if I'd like a drink. I opted for water, and she sat down beside me and said that on days as hot as this, it made absolutely no sense to wear clothes. Didn't I agree? Yes, I did agree. Then there was a silence. I wasn't sure whether I was supposed to toss off all my clothes and sit there beside her, or comment on how cool she looked without them. In the end, I just sat there, blood rushing to all extremities, and drank my water. Cliff strolled in, and at least he was in his underpants. He asked me why I was there. I told him I'd been told he wanted to paint my hands. He nodded. Yes, he did. But he didn't know whether he'd bother because the portrait was so lifeless it wasn't worth finishing. Now, of all the shattering things that can happen to you, being told that you can only inspire a couple of square metres of lifelessness is one of life's hardest blows. Here I was, timidly clothed in the heart of naked Bohemia, and not nearly interesting enough to inspire a work of art. I drove home, and when Kristen asked me how the portrait was going, I was too humiliated to tell her that work had ceased. I couldn't bear her to find out her husband was of so little artistic interest. That Cabinet Minister was still phoning from Canberra, and she might just decide he was a more interesting option. But then a few days later, Cliff called and said he'd had a new fit of inspiration and that my portrait had been revived and that he thought it was going to be one of his very best. I was delighted. When could I see it? He was a bit cagey, but a few days later he rang, sounding pleased, and said he'd had quite a few people look at it, and they all felt he'd done an amazing job of capturing my true essence. As I've said, I already knew what my true essence was. It was that good-natured, straightforward, affable chap with no vices, sensitive, sympathetic, all of that. I leapt in my Peugeot 405, bought because the dirt tracks up our way could only be negotiated by the car that had won the Red X trial 3 times, and leapt out, anxious to see my fine inner qualities beaming out of the canvas. "What do you think?" said Cliff, and I gasped. There, staring at me, was the most evil, Machiavellian, cruel-lipped and treacherous human being I had ever seen since Laurence Olivier played the hunchback Richard III. Why had Cliff done this to me? Had I smothered Princes in the Tower? Had I murdered my brother and slept with the wife of the man I'd just murdered after seducing her at the husband's graveside? He looked at me narrowly. "You don't like it." Well, I said, that guy on the canvas isn't exactly going to win friends and influence people. So you don't like it, he said. Well, it's a shock, I said. Good, he said, always blunt and to the point. If you weren't shocked, it would mean I painted what you think you are rather than what you really are. Am I really like that? I said, still in a state of semi-shock. Mate, he said, you're the guy that watched his mates make fools of themselves at your election night party, then calmly pinned them down like moths on a collector's cushion so that the whole world could observe them. He was referring to my election night play, Don's Party. You're not a participator in life, he said, you're an observer, and a very judgmental observer, just like I am. I recognised a kindred spirit, he said. Don't worry, if I was doing my self-portrait, it would come out much crueler than that. And I realised that in a sense we were in the same line of work. Cliff had a laser-like perception of other people's vanities, self-delusions and weaknesses. It was precisely why he was such a good portrait painter. There was no sentiment to him. He saw through facades, which I was noted for doing. The characters I typically create in a play aren't strictly realistic. Their vanities are heightened, their self-delusions made a little greater, their weaknesses exaggerated. Most of my work has a satirical edge, as like Cliff and like all satirists, I'm somewhat of a moralist. I look at the world and am embarrassed by how badly and selfishly and foolishly people often behave. Satire is in some ways a moral weapon. By exaggerating and heightening people's foibles, one comments on how foolish they are and suggests that life would be easier for everyone if we stopped playing games and were a little more honest, kind, and with ourselves and with others. But like most people, I'd built a false perception of myself to protect and nurture my ego. And another clear-sighted artist had pierced it and made me see myself more truthfully. In a sense, Cliff had turned the tables on me and shown me what I had done to others. In fact, this ability of all of us to construct an image of ourselves that's invariably more flattering than reality is precisely what blunts the force of satire in many cases. I've had so many people, perfect strangers to me, go to my plays and comment to me that I'd really captured someone they knew, their husband, their friend, a work colleague, or whoever. Not once in my whole career has anyone come out embarrassed saying that that awful character on stage was just like them. I wasn't imagining what was there in the painting. Cliff lent me the painting to hang in our place for a while. Kristen was more enthused about this idea than I was, but there it was. My young daughter from my first marriage stared at it and shuddered. Mum said you seem nice, she said, but you're really not, and I can see what she meant. My first wife, my young son Rory stared at it and howled. We couldn't stop him, even a feed wouldn't stop him. Finally, I had to insist with Kristen that it was a big plus, okay, to have an Archibald Prize-winning artist painting hanging on our walls, but it had to go. I don't know where the painting is now, but ever since I saw it, I've been forced to accept that there's a little bit of Richard III lurking under my benign exterior. But that's what makes the Archibald fascinating. A perceptive artist can reveal truth that up to then no one has really seen. It's what makes artists artists. Thank you, and for those who might be wondering, Kristen never did go off to Canberra, as far as I know. Thank you.